Hey there, folks. Today's show is fantastic. I had the chance to sit down with author and management consultant Andy Brown and talk about his new book, Emotional Overdraft. Actually, I think the book's been out a couple of years, but it is his most recent book and it is fantastic. The full title is actually The Emotional Overdraft 10 Simple Changes for Balancing Business Success and Well-Being. I had such a great conversation with Andy because one of the things that we discussed was as entrepreneurs, as business leaders, one of the things that we often forget about doing is managing the single most important business machine each and every one of us has, which is ourselves, our mind, and our emotions. If we're constantly making withdrawals and never putting deposits into our emotional bank, then we're going to come up short. We're going to be operating at a deficit. And that's exactly what Andy explains during this incredibly far-reaching, wide-ranging conversation that I had so much fun talking to him about. So I hope you enjoy this. Thanks for listening to the Jason Wright Show. Please subscribe to the podcast. And if you happen to be watching on YouTube, please consider subscribing, liking, leaving some comments, and get in touch with Andy. I know he'd be a great resource for you. And with that, enjoy this episode of the Jason Wright Show with Andy Brown, author of The Emotional Overdraft, 10 Simple Changes for Balancing Business Success and Well-Being. Thanks for listening. Andy Brown, welcome to the Jason Wright Show. I am so glad to have you here, sir.
Well, thank you for having me. And a podcast where someone can say, if we're standing at the top of the mountain looking down, we're doing it wrong, which I think was Zach a week or two ago. I thought that was just such a lovely quote. I thought that's the podcast I want to be on. So thank you for having me.
I appreciate you saying that. And I would absolutely love to connect you with Zach. I think that you would be an excellent guest for his show. That was a great conversation. And so thank you so much for saying that. And I couldn't agree more. I am thrilled to have you because this, as I mentioned briefly before we started recording, Emotional Overdraft, or The Emotional Overdraft, which is the book that we're going to be talking about today that you wrote. I think it's something that so many entrepreneurs, business leaders struggle with and probably have never even thought to identify it, why they're exhausted, why their brains are tapped out, why their performance is slipping, and why they find themselves, what I would say, looking now at their vocation as drudgery, which once upon a time was something that was their greatest source of satisfaction and stimulation and excitement. So with that, let's just start, as they say, from the beginning, Andy. Tell us why you wrote the book, and then let's get a definition of terms. Let's talk about what do you mean by emotional overdraft?
Yeah, sure, happy to do that. So I suppose a bit of background. I was a researcher. I paid my way through college by working for research companies. I was one of those people that walk up to you in the street and say, "Hey, would you mind answering some questions?" And because my parents' view was that, my education was on me. Once they were going to subsidize me through college, which was, great. And I respected them for that, but it meant I had to work hard. So I started in research. That led me to marketing. I spent years as a planner, strategist, in agencies. Ran some businesses, ran a couple of my own, sold two, sold one for reasonable money, sold one for very bad money. So I've experienced both sides of that joy. But eventually I became an advisor, a non-executive director, working with creative communications research businesses to help them build more value in their business. And I've done that for the last 7 or 8 years. And all of the people I talked to, there was a commonality, which was this idea that whatever the question was, they were the answer. So, we need to drive the new business pipeline. And they go, okay, what do I need to do? And how do I do that? It didn't really matter the size. I generally work with smaller businesses, but it didn't really matter the size of the business. It would be that sort of founder, leader, the buck stops with me mentality. Or it was, we're having a problem with a member of staff. They would be the person that would pile in and fix it. There'll be a key client where something goes wrong. They'd be the person that steps in to intermediate. The answer was always them. And lots of the work I do with my clients right from the start has been, how do you extract yourself from that? How do you build a scalable business? How do you build a valuable business? And you build and this isn't just for entrepreneurs. This is leadership as well. this is, I've had people who read the book who are mothers and say, this resonates with me, because that's a form of leadership. It's a beautiful form of leadership. But I generally talk about people founding businesses because that's the audience I address specifically in the book. And it's about looking at the habit and the behavior and trying to understand why that was happening. So I was seeing this happening again and again and again. I didn't have a name for it, but I'd talk about it. It's quite hard to describe. You have to give examples. And so I thought there must be this commonality of behavior. There must be something here there must be a name for this thing. And it turns out there wasn't. So I went back to my roots. I did some research. I spoke to 50 company founders and leaders and said, what do these things resonate with you? And if I called it an emotional overdraft, how does that feel? Does that sound like the thing? And that every single person said, yes, I've got one. Yes, I wish I didn't. And yes, emotional overdraft kind of sums up what that thing is. Because I'm a marketeer, I'd sort of package it up. And so I did the research. It took me about 2 years to write the book. But that idea of an overdraft is pretty universal concept. And an overdraft is a good thing. It's good to have a facility, to have the ability to go overdrawn, to dip in where you don't quite have the funds available for a very short period of time. You can use that money in a bank, do what you need to do, and then you pay it back very quickly. Because we all understand that an overdraft is an expensive form of borrowing, but it's useful. And so I thought, well, that's sort of how it should be, but emotionally, and by emotionally, I'm talking about behaviors and feelings as well as, feelings. We're talking about feelings in business. Well, who is this guy? But feelings matter, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But the idea of an emotional overdraft, so this is intangible and tangible concept. It just sounded right to me, and people really responded to it. They really responded to the concept. So, and the idea of an overdraft being, if you're overdrawn all the time financially, it's going to cost you a lot of money. It's going to cost you disproportionately more than it should do for the limited amount of benefit you get from an overdraft. If you need to borrow money for legitimate reasons, to grow your business, to buy another business, to buy some capital goods, to buy a house, buy a car, there are really good organized financial structures that are affordable, designed for that purpose. An overdraft is not designed to trade in all the time. So cut to emotional overdraft, my definition of I invented it. So my definition of that is it's when you're subsidizing the success of your business at your own mental or physical cost. I'll repeat it. It's when you're subsidizing the success of your business at your own mental or physical cost. And you can subsidize business for activity or family or community, because we've all been there. This is, you've all been in that sort of situation where we can't say no, for example. But you're subsidizing the success. And I talk to people who are very successful, who are doing really well, but they still feel this thing is draining them, that they're feeling like they haven't got the energy, or that they're starting to resent. I love the way you talked about this idea that relationship with your own business is changing. What used to bring you power, what used to bring you energy, what used to plug you in, is no longer a radiator. It's become a drain. It's net negative. It's taking from you. So that's what I called it, because it's this idea that in the end, people are subsidizing the success of that business at their own mental and or physical cost. And what I see is stress, typically, which has, the sort of impacts that you can understand. But stress, it can become burnout. So burnout is more common. And I don't think we used to call it burnout, but it's now got a label, and it's useful to understand what that thing is. And there are people, who burn out again and again, perhaps, and worse. So it could be stress, it could be burnout, it could be overwhelm, it could be depression. And I've been in that position myself. I've been absolutely, and I talk about it in the book, where I was working so hard. I hated every minute of it. I was missing my kids growing up. I remember there's an occasion when I drove to a meeting, and it was in a place called Dover in the UK. And Dover is the closest place to France. It's 22 miles to France from Dover. I live down that way. People call us the French, basically. You're that close. But I was driving to a meeting in Dover, and 1 minute I was going to the meeting, and the next minute I'd driven onto a ferry, which goes across the channel. They go every hour. and I was on a ferry going to France. And I sort of came out of this bug of thinking that I was in, and I was on a ferry, and I thought, what the hell has happened here? But what had happened was I just couldn't face going to the meeting. I hadn't processed it that way, but my brain had just taken me somewhere. To save me, it had gone, keep driving, get in the queue, buy a ticket, get on the ferry, go to France, make something up when you get home. And so I went to France. I was committed. You can't get off. You can't turn around. It's not a bridge. You go to France, it takes an hour and a half. You have to wait for the next ferry. You have to come back. You miss the meeting. You go home. You feel terrible. But something had happened in my brain to stop me going to that meeting. And yet I was running a business, a reasonably successful business, which relied on me going to those sorts of meetings to win new business, to keep the business going. And it was starting to happen more and more. And years later, I spoke to my team, my management team about it. And they said, Andy, we knew you were doing this. You'd come back and say, oh, the client canceled a meeting, but we knew these things were happening and we didn't know how to help you. We didn't know how to talk to you about it. And I think if you have a phrase like emotional overdraft, it then gives you a chance to talk about it. It gives you a label that's useful. It's shorthand. And you go, maybe I'm too deep in my overdraft. Maybe I've been here too long and I need to do something differently. Or my team could have said, Andy, we think you're dipping into your overdraft too much right now. It's starting to affect your impact on the business. Maybe you need to take a break. Maybe you need to do something differently. Maybe you need to delegate. And that's what's interesting in the research, was understanding why it happens. I was fascinated by this consistency of behaviors that happen to people that run businesses, that there aren't that many ways to run a business and not that many ways of thinking. So that was interesting. And that was really helpful, because as soon as I realized there was some consistency and you could pull together, however people described their feeling, you could kind of aggregate them into about 10 areas. Then you think, well, okay, now I can start to do something about that. I can give people some advice. I can give people some advice about what they could do about it. And originally, when I wrote the book, I gave it to the publisher and they said, this is fantastic. Love this book. Where's the rest of it? And what I'd written was a book about what emotional overdraft is, why it happens, how emotions are in business. I hadn't written the back half, which is what you do about the problem. So they sent me back away and I had to write the other half of the book, which I found straightforward because that's my day job. My day job has been doing that with people for the last nearly 10 years. So that's what an emotional overdraft is. Yeah, a bit of a monologue. Sorry there, Jason.
No, it's excellent. It's a wonderful tee-up because, and this is again why the topic in your book resonated so well with me. So about 5 years ago, I would say, I got really steeped in health and wellness and health span, longevity. And one of the first topics I started to look at was cardiovascular health. And Dr. Stephen Hussey, who is actually a trained chiropractor, he is also a type 1 diabetic and suffered a heart attack at a very young age. And he started looking at endothelial health and cardiovascular health. And he uh, he wrote a book, I believe it's called Understanding the Heart or something to that effect. I'm sorry if I'm calling the title wrong, but he's been on the show a couple of times. And that's where I started to, from him and discussing this with him, start to really understand the correlation between whether it's emotional overdraft, stress, all this. There is a both mental, emotional, and physical component to this. We hear so often
Mm.
of these executives that run, jog every day, they play tennis, and then they're in their mid 40s, early 50s, and they drop dead of a heart attack. And we ask ourselves, how's this possible? Well, I think a lot of it has to do with what you're talking about. I do think there is a component to this that is going to show up in physical stress. A lot of the people that, when you do the research, you figure out that a lot of people who are overweight, well, their mitochondrial health or their metabolic health rather is suffering due to lack of sleep, overstress, high cortisol levels. So all of this plays a part. And I think that, even though you wrote the book 2 years ago, I think we're finally getting to a point where a lot of entrepreneurs and business leaders are realizing that in order to be at our best, we have to maintain strong emotional and health and both sympathetic and parasympathetic health. And so that's why, to me, all of this makes perfect sense. Now, one of the things that I'm really curious about, Andy, and I do like the way you associate your emotional health with that of, say, a bank account and how much you can draw on it. That's something that clicked with me whenever I started doing this research and the things we're talking about is that I started looking at it as a battery, if you will. You know, you've got your
Mm.
battery's low, your battery's high, and you've got to be able to understand where you are in the charging process, or as you're saying, and you got to see how many months reserves or days reserves or hours reserves you have in the checking account before you go tapping for more and more, but and then end up overspending and getting into to an overdraft. How does someone start to take what their stomach, their physical presence, you going to your meetings, the signs will show up.
Mm. Oh, the
How do
body keeps the score. I love that expression. The
absolutely
body
100
keeps the score. And whatever your brain is trying to convince you of, your brain lies. Your body keeps the score. And I spoke with a guy who called Paul O'Malley, who set up a creative agency in New York for a British company,
Mhm.
incredibly successfully. But he started blacking out,
Wow.
and his body was going, we need to shut down. We need to stop. He went to a doctor, and the doctor said, "You're extremely anxious. You're very stressed, and you're having blackouts." And Paul went, "No, I'm not. I'm doing really well. The business is successful. We're doing great. Everything's fine." And he was so convinced that everything was okay, despite the fact he was blacking out, to the point where he fainted and nearly fell under a bus. Someone grabbed him from falling under a bus in London when he was back in the UK. So that's how strong the mind can be at convincing us that we're okay, but the body keeps the score. So I think your point's absolutely spot on.
So how
Sorry,
do we
Stephen.
start how that's excellent. How do we start to notice these signals, to notice that our account's running low and make this some sort of a quantitative measure to where we can manage the levels and do and start to understand how to get compounding interest so that we can bank our emotions. One of the things that this is reminding me a great deal of, there's a great book by Jim Lair, who is a sports psychologist, legendary sports psychologist, trained many world-class tennis players. That was kind of his wheelhouse, but now and I think he works with Josh Waitzkin and a lot of just really brilliant performers in both stress management, and his deal is energy management. He's always said that when he noticed two champions on the tennis court, one who was just not quite as consistent and one who was very consistent, he noticed that between serves, they did the exact same thing. And it wasn't just some sort of like ritual or superstition, but what they were doing is they were tapping into energy management. And he always talks about how, like a sprinter will go all out for a very brief period of time, but it's their absolute best, and it's gonna be the absolute best output they do, but they're not gonna do that all the time. He talks about how athletes in baseball, there's an off season to rest and to train and to bank that energy, and that he attributes, you know, energy management as being how you really perform at the highest level. This seems like the exact same thing to me. If we can figure out a way to bank our emotional intelligence or our emotional energy to only use it when it's going to have the greatest impact, then that's got to give us a leg up. So how do you start to quantifiably bank that energy and
Mm.
use it when necessary and not not get that overdraft notice of turning around whenever it's time to go to a meeting or blacking out or worse yet, a heart attack or something like that? How do we
Yeah,
start to
and
do
we do
that?
it, and we do it all the time in business.
Mhm.
Leaders, founders, entrepreneurs, we expect to be always on all the time,
Yep.
year after week after week, month after month, year after year. And that's palpably nonsense. I had a client who's talked publicly about this, so I can talk about it, but he never took half term is, I don't think it's a thing in the States, but halfway through a term or a semester, we have a little break just to give the kids we go, these kids they're studying, they need a 1 week break in the middle of this to recover, to recharge. And lots of people go on holiday. All of his team would go on holiday. And he has now teenagers. and had never taken a half-term break with his kids because he always felt it wasn't his job to have the break. It was his team should have the break. And I said, this is madness. This is designed to give them a little recharge, to plug in their cell phone, if you like. You could be doing the same. And if you do that with them, you're going to get 10x, 20x from that because you'll be with your children. You'll be feed off their energy. He said, yeah, but it's not really, I'm the boss. I'm supposed to, be last in the queue. I said, let's ask your team what they think. And they went, we have no idea why he does this. We think we should just have a draw. Each half term, 3 of us can have half term holiday and we'll take it in turns. And he had no idea that that's how they felt. He felt it was just his job remorselessly to keep working and keep working and keep working. And what they saw was a guy becoming less, he crawled to Christmas in the UK. We have a long break at Christmas. He'd get to Christmas, he'd get a cold, he'd pick up some illness. He'd spend the whole of Christmas not with his family, but being sick. And then New Year comes around, back to work, it all starts again, and off we go again. That's how he genuinely thought. That's what he thought his job was. So you're exactly right. I think there's a couple of ways to manage that capacity. So we think of emotions as feelings. That's maybe an easier way to think of them. What's interesting about our feelings is an amazing coach I work with called Rena Loizy, who said that our feelings are a measure of the quality of our thinking. And it's just, if my wife would let me have another tattoo, that's what I'd get. And she would divorce me if I did, so that won't happen. But our feelings are the measure of the quality of our thinking is such, and think about what that means. What you're feeling frustrated, you're feeling angry, you're feeling irritated, you're feeling tired. If you stop and recognize that feeling, and we don't tend to recognize feelings, we run past them. But if you recognize the feeling and you go, hang on, so if that's a measure of the quality of my thinking, what's going on in my thinking right now? And we create our feelings in our own thinking. They do not exist outside of us. We create them in our brains. We create our entire world in our brains. And I'll give you an example. If you're driving your car and someone cuts you up, I was going to say at a roundabout, but you only have about 10 roundabouts in the whole of the US, don't you? But someone cuts you up at a junction. You can lean out of the window and you'd be shouting abuse and shaking your fist and getting all red-faced about it. Angry. There's the feeling. Now, as a measure of the quality of your thinking in that moment, if you could stop and go, hang on, Andy, what are you doing? You're a grown-up. What is that? Did that person cut me up because they're rushing somewhere, because they've got someone injured in the back of the car? Maybe they didn't see me. Maybe it wasn't personal. You could stop and suddenly recalibrate that. The other thing is, if you had your partner in the back of the car who's about to give birth and you were trying to get to the hospital, and I've been in that situation in a traffic jam with my wife and our second child, I was thinking, we're not going anywhere. Do I have to carry her somewhere? Or genuinely, if someone had cut me up, I wouldn't have even noticed because I was so focused on how do I get her to the hospital. Exactly the same situation, exactly the same players, but my brain in that moment is thinking all about my wife and my next child, not about the person cutting my car up. So the feelings, the emotions are being created in my brain. And people go, oh, he made me cross, or she did something to trigger me. That's just not true. And there's a whole nother book in this, but understand that our thinking creates our feelings. And so if we follow that through, our thinking creates our feelings, and our feelings create our behaviors. And then our behaviors drive our outcomes. So it's really, really important to understand or to recognize the moment when you are feeling something, having an emotional response, getting angry about something, because that's such a good clue that you could be doing it differently. So that's I think the way to spot it. So, and let's put it in a business context. You've got a member of staff who's relatively new. They're writing a report. It's not the way you would have written it. They bring it to you to get it signed off. You go, oh, this is just not right. This is not right. Okay, cross out, cross out, cross out. I'm frustrated. I'm irritated. I'm late for another meeting. I'm getting a bit annoyed with them. Tell you what, I'll do it. I'll do it myself. You send them away. And that's a very, very habitual behavior. That is something you will see that, you might call that a JFDI behavior. I call it in the book, which is just flipping do it. It's a bit of control freakery. It's a lack of trust in the individual. And it feels like in the moment, the right thing to do is you're busy as hell. You've got a long to-do list, but you go, I'll do it. And again, I see founders doing this. But actually, that's the worst thing you could do. The best thing you could do is take that time and invest it in the individual and help them understand what would have been a better report, how they could have done it differently. Because then, teach a man to fish rather than give him a fish. It's not quite the expression, is it? But it's a very old book. So that idea, and we kind of know it, but habit says, I'll do it. So if you can spot those things, though in that moment, the triggers I'd be looking at were frustration, irritation, well, you would need more words for feelings, but just to take those two, irritation, anger, possibly. That's the quality of my thinking, and that's not good enough. So what can I do about it? What could I do differently? Hang on, Andy, hang on, don't just snatch it off them. Because what have I done in that moment? Not only have I created more work for myself, I've undermined that individual. I've made them feel probably made them feel a bit small. I've disappointed them. I've missed a training opportunity. They're probably not going to bother next time because they say, well, Andy always does that. So I'll do the best I can, but I won't worry too much about it because Andy's going to rewrite it anyway. And then one morning I'll wake up and go, how come all my staff are idiots? How come I've got a company populated by people who don't take pride in their work? Well, hey, Andy, you just trained them. There's no such thing as bad dogs, just bad owners, So this is that behavior ultimately. And if you're a certain type of thinker, you will be firing those people. How come we can't find good people anymore? How come millennials are so lazy? How come no one's as good as me? This is Team America, that amazing, it's a Team America film. I think it was Kim Jong-un they did, how come everyone's so stupid?
Yep.
He goes, and that's that sense of, because you're making it happen. And so I know it feels difficult. If there are people listening to this going, yeah, Andy, but if I'm crazy busy, sometimes it is easier just to do it. It's really not. It's easier. It feels easier in the moment, but you are creating more and more work for yourself and you're demoralizing your staff and teaching them bad habits. So I think that's a really good example, practical example. Going back to your question, how do we actually make it tangible? How do we know if we're saving it up or spending it, if we're running in the overdraft? It's very difficult because emotions are hard to quantify and everyone's base level is somewhere different. And sometimes people say to me, but Andy, if you're setting up a business, you're running a business, you have to be, it is stressful. It is remorseless. It is hard. Yes, sometimes, but no, not always. And there has to be a net for you to do it successfully. There has to be a net positive. Otherwise you just can't carry on doing it. So yes, sometimes it is and sometimes it isn't. And the way I've come up with it, because I'm a management consultant, I'm trained in finance as well. And the finance teams, when I'm in a board meeting, all had all the numbers at their fingertips. What were the sales? What's the revenue? What were the costs? What was the margin? What are all the ratios? They can measure everything. And that makes you think that they've got the knowledge. But if you think about a profit and loss, you could make a big profit. You could go, here we go, end of the year, bottom right-hand corner, there's our profit for the year. Haven't we done well? But the invisible line in the costs is the emotional overdraft. What cost has that profit really been at? And because we can't measure emotional overdraft, we don't put it in the numbers, so we ignore it and finance people pretend it doesn't exist. But it is there. And if you really could quantify it in terms of money, you'd go, okay, here's the profit, but we've got to take off that, the cost, the emotional cost, the physical cost, the mental cost that it's cost me as the founder and my leadership team, my whole team, their families, my family, because this thing flows out. Emotional overdraft is bloody greedy. It will borrow from everywhere. It'll borrow from your partner. It'll borrow from your kids. It'll borrow from the time that you used to spend in the gym. It'll borrow from the time you used to spend with your community. it will soak up as much as it can and it'll make it look like nothing's happening. So it's insidious. The way I think about it, the best solution I've come up with is to effectively to make a diary entry each day. It's a log each day. And we all suffer from recency bias. So you can't do this at the end of the week or the end of the month. You need to do every day. You need to stop at the end of the day, find a moment. And I know you're going, Andy, we're crazy busy. We don't need another thing to do. This is moments. And just go from the start of the day to now. Has my emotional overdraft gone up? Have I borrowed more? Am I more in debt? Or has it stayed about the same, or has it come down? And why do I think that? And it might be, it's come down today because that member of staff that I took on 3 months ago is really kicking it. They're absolutely thriving. They were a great hire. They're taking work off other people. I can see a future there. And generally today, that's been great. So that's a day when your emotional overdraft has gone down. And in that world, I put -1. So the only measure you have here is +1 if your emotional overdraft has gone up, 0 if it hasn't changed, and -1 if it's gone down. Start with 100, normal baseline. At the end of the month, do it every day. At the end of the month, you might have had 20 days when it's gone up, 5 days when it's gone down, and 5 days when it stayed the same. So net 15 days. Sorry, net -15. So your emotional overdraft has got worse by 15. So it started at 100 and it's now at 115. So in that month, you may have had great reasons for having to be, when I run an advertising agency, you have pitches where we'd spend a whole week pulling all-nighters. We'd be absolutely shattered. And that's what you had to do. When I started businesses, I worked all the hours, and you have to do that. But you also have to pay it back. So if you measure it across a month and it's gone from 100, whatever that means, your baseline, to 115, then you should look back at that and look back at your little notes you've made and go, well, what are the things that are happening when my emotional overdraft is getting worse? Are there any patterns emerging in that? Is there anything that's consistently happening that's making me feel like my emotional overdraft has got worse? And if it has got worse across the month, do the exercise again the next month. Because if it goes from 100 to 115 to 128 to 131 to 145, every month you're trading in the negative. It's getting worse. And that's really when you need to do something differently. And that's how I would say to quantify an emotional overdraft. It's a relative thing rather than an actual quantifiable thing, but it does give you a chance to say, I am actually every month, I'm not repaying this, I'm getting worse. That's how I'd probably do it. It's primitive, but I think it works.
Well, I think sometimes the most primitive solutions are often the best because they're why try to overcomplicate things? What gets complicated gets broken. I love that idea for a number of reasons. Again, I like to kind of correlate it with some other topic. Well, you think to yourself, I would never, as far as physical training goes, I'm never going to work my arms 3 days in a row with no rest. I'm not going to do that. But we have such a hard time of thinking of our emotional health, our mental health in the same way that I went hard to the hoop. I mean, I drove really hard to get the sales presentation out. Like you're talking about with your running your ad agency, we're doing 3 pitches this week, and that's going to be late nights, a lot of stress, a lot of things we can't control. Sleep is going to be deprived. You would never do that and then go, okay, bring on the next project. Let's go. It would be like, going to a weightlifting competition, then working out for 3 days in a row, then doing an Ironman, and then it would make no sense.
But people do.
But people do it all the time. And, one of the things where I think that, or one of the industries rather, I think this is really starting to show up with hopefully a little bit more awareness is investment banking, for instance. Investment banking is kind of notoriously known for taking young professionals and just exhausting them to the nth degree, right? I mean, just wearing them out, 90-hour weeks. And if you survive, yeah, you're going to be rich and successful, and you're going to go into venture capital, private equity, or investment banking at a senior level. But
you're going to be rich. You might not be successful.
Exactly.
Depends how you measure success, doesn't it?
And that's what I was getting at, Andy. You know what it reminds me of? A lot of those guys they're kind of like the Chinese with the Ferraris and Lamborghinis. They will never be able to drive those Ferraris and Lamborghinis at their top speed because there's no infrastructure for it. on the streets of China, but they have them. I remember, the times I've been in Asia, in Shanghai in particular, you see these individuals driving these like a pink Lamborghini, just kind of cruising through these tiny little streets they could barely get through. They've got the car, but they'll never be able to enjoy it. It's kind of the same way with these people that don't take the time to enjoy or balance out a living, making good money with no way to spend all the money because you're working all the time, or you die before you get to enjoy it because you've tapped in to so much of your mental state that you're exhausted. Um, to me, that's kind of the biggest detriment to all of this. But one of the things I can guarantee you, a lot of entrepreneurs, and you kind of touch on it, a lot of entrepreneurs or business leaders are hearing this and they're like, it just sounds to me like you're making excuses for weak-minded people. And I I get frustrated whenever I start to talk to somebody like that and they just don't get it because what they feel like, kind of like your friend that at the midterms they wouldn't take the time off, let the team off, is they just don't seem to equate exercise, again, physical exercise. I remember whenever I bought my first business, 1 o'clock every afternoon, I met with a group and we went up to a gym and we physically trained. And at first I felt so guilty, Andy. I felt so guilty for taking time off in the middle of the day.
Yeah, people do. People do.
Oh man. But then I started to realize if I don't do this, then I'm going to be far less effective when I get back for or for the rest of the afternoon than if I go break my day up and just again, building my immunity up, building up, sleeping better, all the other benefits of physical exercise. But it's so hard for people to realize, even as you folks over in the UK say, going on holiday. People think that's a luxury. I can't. No, I pride myself on the fact that I don't go on vacations. Well, that's actually pretty stupid because you never give your body time to recover. Sleep. We know how important sleep is now. There's more and more research. I mean, every expert out there from Peter Attia to Andrew Huberman to Ben Greenfield, fill in the blank, all these incredible physicians and health and wellness experts saying the single best thing you can do is get good quality sleep. But somehow it's so hard to get these hard charging, successful people that I got to believe you consult to buy into the fact that this downtime, this emotional recovery is every bit as important as crushing that presentation or going and getting the MBA. As far as other wellness and well-being, managing our emotional health is right up there with it. Am I right? Do you face that?
You are. And the people I work with and the people I talk to and the feedback I get from people who read the book, these are not people who are weak-willed individuals. These are not people who are failing. That successful people can balance their lives. And you could argue that actually balancing your life is success. I know an investment banker who, I don't know, was 20 when he went into the city, 55 now, richer than he'll ever need to be, houses all over the place, 3 divorces, kids that don't talk to him, bald, fat, ill. What's he doing with his money now? What's he got? Trophy wife, maybe number 4, is probably what'll happen next, sad to say. So is that success? Maybe it is if you measure it by money, but if you measure it by what have you contributed to society? What have you contributed to your community? What kind of kids have you brought into the world? What influence have you had on them? What are you passing on to people? Then you've got to say, maybe not, maybe less successful than you think. And I know that makes me sound like a liberal, but I don't mind being called a liberal. I'm a pluralist, actually. I see both ends of this. And I see the world. I think you can have balance. I think you have to have balance. And if you take the holidays and if you go to the gym, people who go, I don't have time to exercise. I worked for an amazing guy years ago, way before I wrote this book. And he built his own office and we went from about 50 staff to 150 staff in a couple of years, really big growth. And when he built the office, he built a huge dining room in the middle of the building. And he insisted that no one we called it eating al desco, when people eat their lunch at their desk. He insisted that people could not eat at their desk. They had to eat lunch in the dining room. And to do that, he realized he had to lay on lunch. So he laid on lunch for all the staff. They had caterers. A very googly thing to do, way ahead of his time. But what it meant was people had lunch They stopped. They spoke to each other. They connected. They shared problems. They ideated. They came up with different solutions. They made connections in that business. They felt committed. They worked longer, actually, because they felt invested in the business, and the business was invested in them. And he sold that business after a few years for a very substantial amount of money. And well done him for doing it. And no one resented him for it. But that's an incredibly successful man by any measure. But he's also created a business which absolutely founded on the understanding that if you treat people properly, if you consider health, if you consider wellness, and in fact, interestingly, he started that business with former convicts. So it was more or less all of his staff in the early days were former prisoners. And the reoffending rate in the UK is about 80%. And the reoffending rate from people who'd been through his business was about 10%. So he made money. He created loads of people left that business and went up and set up their own businesses because they were inspired by the way he ran his business. And he took people out of a system that was broken and put them back into the world as people who were going to contribute. I mean, astonishing. Now that, in my world, is success.
I could not agree more. I think it's just getting people to understand that whenever downtime does not make you lazy. It does not make you, you're not French overnight just because you decide you're prioritizing time off and downtime, right? I mean, the French are really good at it. They know.
But
They
if your phone runs out of battery,
Hmm.
you wouldn't stand over the phone shouting,
Exactly.
one more call, one more call. You would know that is utterly ridiculous. Because
Right.
if the battery's gone, the battery's gone.
Right.
But yet we treat ourselves, we run the battery down, and then we treat ourselves like badly. I was going to say a rude word. We treat ourselves with no respect at all, because it's just as stupid to shout at ourselves in our heads to keep going, don't be weak. This is failure. You're the boss. You've got to do this thing. So it's madness. It would be embarrassing to stand on the tube shouting into your phone, just give me a call now if the battery's gone. But that's kind of how we treat ourselves. It's truly insane.
It is. And I want to get into some of your solutions for some of this, because again, like I was saying before, as far as trying to look at this, is like we know for financial discipline, spend less than you make, invest regularly, set it and forget it. There's all these principles that we know will build wealth over the long term. And here are some of the things that I know to some degree I have put elements of this into practice for my own life. So this really resonated with me. But in part 3 of your book on how to reduce your emotional overdraft, I'm going to read through these and we can just kind of discuss them a little bit. But create a personal goal to work towards, develop a vision and a plan, clarify your role, put in place an organizational structure to support your vision, challenge your thinking. All of these, the reason why I think they're so profound, and what I've noticed in my life, nothing lowers stress like a well executed plan. If I just
Isn't it boring?
Oh,
Isn't it boring? The answer is so boring.
it
But
is.
is so always right.
It is. It's just and the reason why, and correct me if I'm wrong, Andy, I think one of the things that people despise more than anything else, over here, we're obviously in the middle of a political cycle, and Americans, like all other humans, they hate the unknown. We cannot stand the potential element of surprise. And I have learned that if I can take the time the night before to print my schedule for the following day, just have a look at it and at least know conceptually what my day should look like. There might be changes. I might have to be flexible. That's fine. But at least I know it lowers my cognitive load to such a degree. And then if I have some sort of vision for my life and that I can apply to that day, then I can ask myself questions like, well, it helps me to better measure opportunity costs. Am I about to go into a conversation, a business meeting, a business deal that truly lines up with my vision? And what are the opportunity costs of that? And I'm just a better decision maker overall. And then, but the final one that you get to, which I think is fantastic, is because I think it's the one that causes the biggest problem. And we've kind of talked about it prior, is this challenging your thinking, that taking 30 minutes. I remember Ryan Holiday, he was talking about how people think, like in his job, which is as an author and speaker and I guess kind of a philosopher at this point, that reading is part of his job.
Yeah.
But I guarantee if you or I, who are both, I do consulting and coaching and writing, and you do the same thing, people that do what we do, if we were to tell them, you need to take a good hour and sit down and read today, whatever the book might be, take some time to read some Cal Newport on deep work. Just sit and read. People would think that we're crazy. That's not work. Sitting and reading is not work. Or they would try to do it over lunch. I'm going to take time in my lunch. I'm going to sit there, like you say, al desco and eat while I'm, reading. No, take the time. And so I think that challenging your thinking is got to be a huge component to
I
implementing
think it is it.
anything
It is
in
it.
this
You've got
book.
it. Yeah, you've got it. And that's why I talk about habit,
Mm.
because this is about behavior. So your thinking creates your feelings, which creates your behaviors. So your behaviors are what come out of your thinking. And breaking habits, creating habits, building habits is invisible. We don't see it happening, but we do have habits. So breaking habits is incredibly difficult. And there's some amazing books about habit. There's a whole genre of books, Atomic Habits, Tiny Habits, Duhigg, and all those guys. It's some fascinating books about the habit breaking because it is so difficult. And I think that's really challenging your behaviors is about that. It's about saying, could you do something different? Could you do something different once? Or could you do something slightly different once? Could you try to do it differently? And the critical thing is to recognize it's happening. If you don't recognize it's happening, if you're not going slowly enough to even notice it, then you'll never change it. You're in problems. But if you can notice it, then you can start to do something differently. And then that is really simple stuff. I had a client meeting this morning, had a board meeting this morning, and the MD of the company said, she had her head in her hands, and she said, Andy, if we really understood the vision for the business, what we were really trying to achieve, if we were more clear about it, she said, that would help every decision we make. And we've been talking about going to the US and their plan for going to the US, buying another business, and lots and lots of big business decisions that were critical to their business. And I said, absolutely, this is why I've been saying this. This is why I think it's so important. But she'd had that penny drop moment. She'd gone, because if we knew what it was we were actually trying to do, are we trying to be bigger? Are we trying to be more profitable? Are we trying to be the best in our market? Or are we just trying to, what is it that we actually want to achieve as a business? Then everything else just becomes, will it help us get there or will it not help us get there? If it won't help us get there, let's not do it. Suddenly all your decision-making becomes a bit simpler because it's taking us there or it's not taking us there. If it's not taking us there, then we don't do it. And I call it the sort of the steel thread through the business. Just hold on to the steel thread and it will generally guide you in the right direction. So you're right. It's totally about changing behavior. And for the individual, because this is all a bit macro, for the individual, this is about saying, can I do something different? Do I have to do the thing I'm doing? Do I have to keep snatching that off that first jobber and saying, I'll do it? Equally, it can be changing the way you think about your to-do list. You talked about your calendar and your to-do list. The to-do list is and what someone once said to me, your inbox is just somebody else's to-do list. I love that description of it. It's just that idea. But I don't have a to-do list. I have what I call a don't forget list. And, everyone has now decided that I'm a liberal tree hugger, zone out. But what's the difference? It's the same list of things, but a to-do list is a to-do. You have to do this. It's an insistent, annoying, bullying, stressful, awkward thing. And if your relationship with your to-do list is, well, I just have to get it done, every tick is created equal. So what you end up doing are the easy things, the small things. So you've got 6 things done today, but the 3 things you really needed to get done, they just get carried forward onto the next to-do list. So to-do lists don't work for me. But a don't forget list, I can put anything on there and it says, just don't forget this needs to get done. And at the start of each day, I prioritize. I have lots of little sheets of torn up paper on my desk. And I have 2 or 3 things that I take off my don't forget list. And they're the things I have to get done. And I won't go home, although that's just across the garden here now, but I won't go home until those three things, at a minimum, have been achieved, because I know they need to get done today. They're time critical. So I don't have this week or anything like that. I take off my don't forget list. And then I might get a load of extra little ticks and lots of, some endorphin rushes from getting a few more things crossed off my list. But just changing the label from to-do list to don't forget list, or DNF as I call it, then it changes my relationship to that thing. And I promise you, it has changed my relationship. I was a empty email box, empty inbox, get everything done in your to-do list before you go home guy. I'm still an empty inbox guy, but as a don't forget list, it's there to help me. It's there to support me. It's there to make sure I don't forget stuff. The to-do list was a bully, and it's gone. It's gone out of my life. So it's some changing of thinking is behavior, or some changing of thinking is literally about changing the way you see things differently.
Yeah, I could not agree more. That's one of the things on my calendar. So I'm by no means comparing myself to Bill Gates or Warren Buffett, but one of the stories I love is
They compare themselves to you though, Jason. It's interesting. When I speak to them, they always say,
that
if we could be
Jason
more like
Wright, if
Jason.
only we could be more like Jason. I get that
then
a
we'd
lot.
be successful.
I get that a lot, Andy. So I thank you. I wouldn't have said it myself, but
I know, but it's embarrassing for you to say
it. Exactly. But one of the things that those guys do is they try, like Gary Keller, the founder of Keller Williams Realty, they try to keep their date books blank. I've come to appreciate white space. If it gets on the calendar, it has gone through at least a mental screening for me that says, because here's the deal. I see this interview on my schedule. I'm excited about that. I get to speak to somebody who, like your book, I admire your intelligence, and I'm going to learn something. Now that's worthy of my calendar. These people, and it kind of goes to what we're talking about here, this reframing and changing your mindset. A lot of people just the more colors and coding on my calendar, the more important I am. And it's kind of like, I think there's a part of your book where you talk about redefining significance and making yourself redundant. It's no, the truly important people are the ones that can keep a blank calendar. And if you're able to mess up that blank space, you must be pretty important, or it must be pretty important. And that's
so. Can I jump in? I really want to just say,
100%,
because I think that's, we're imagining the person listening to this going, Jason, shut up. I am really busy. I'm really busy. I have loads of things to do. I'm not going to rename my list as to-dos as a don't forget list, because that isn't helping me at all. You guys are just, I'm crazy busy and you're not helping. Actually, let's go back to that thought about the boring stuff. Because if you are so busy that you are having to pack everything in, you are doing something wrong. Your behavior is creating that problem. You could be, if you had better processes, if you were better at planning, if you stopped and thought sometimes, if you spend more time training and developing your teams to be better, if you spend more time recruiting better people rather than hiring people at the last minute, which means you have to have your metrics sorted out. You have to know what your pipeline is. You have to anticipate hiring. This is fundamental root and branch change in your business. You would not to be the person who starts at 6 and finishes at 10. You could change that. Promise you could change that, but it takes a lot of re-engineering. What processes do I need? If I keep doing the same thing, could I do it differently? If there's a process there, could I delegate it? So I talk about this idea of 20% of our time. Do we have time to go through this? Is that
absolutely okay? We got all the time you need. This is fantastic.
Thank you. So think about your calendar, your time, your day, your week. 20% roughly, and this is based on some science, roughly 20% of your time, you are doing stuff that only Jason can do. It's really high value, only Jason stuff. Like this interview. We can't do the Jason Wright Show without Jason Wright. There we go. The next 20% is skilled and specialist, difficult to delegate onto other people, but there are people with very high levels of skill, probably cost a lot of money, who could do that next level of stuff. The middle 20% is less skillful. There's some talent required, there's some skills required, but quite a lot of people can do that. The next 20% that you do, you spend anything you're doing at any time, is not that skilled, but you need some knowledge, some expertise, some training to be able to do it. It's not difficult. Lots of people could be trained to do it. And the last 20%, the bottom 20% of what we all do every day, every week, almost anybody could do. And yet you are spending your time doing, I'll give you a good example, my calendar. My calendar is, I was spending 5 or 6 hours a week moving meetings because my clients will say to me, Andy, I've got a big pitch coming up, or I've got a really important client meeting. I've got to fly to Tokyo and do something. Could we move our meeting? And I'm not the guy who's going to go, no, that's not the way it works. We're never going to move it. Of course I move it. But you move a board meeting, that's 6 or 7 other people's diaries. It means I've got to move it into another date, which means moving some meetings on that day. 5 or 6 hours a week I was doing that. So I thought to myself, Andy, do your own rules. That's 20% of stuff that anyone could be doing. So I got myself a PA. I don't know, she does about 7 or 8 hours a week for me. She doesn't cost me that much an hour. And Jenny, if you're listening, you're fantastic, but you are great value for money. And she sorts my whole diary out. So I could be in a meeting and I'll know that it's getting sorted out by somebody else. So I take that 20% of that time back that Jenny now does. And I can do that, put it back at the top of my list and do more of the stuff that only Andy can do. So instead of having 20% of my time doing only the stuff Andy can do, the real high value stuff, like writing my second book, like speaking to my key clients, like really spending time investing in myself, understanding what the impact of AI on me and my clients, the stuff I need to understand, I get 40% of my time doing that because I've delegated away. Now it's cost me some money. And you might be thinking, well, nice for you, Andy, you can afford it. But the opportunity cost, the opportunity value, if you look at the other side of that equation, is huge because I can now write my second book. I actually don't work on Fridays. I keep Fridays off. I keep it for me time, fitness time, writing time, researching time. I do not, it's very rare I have a client meeting on a Friday.
Same.
And if they do ask for a client meeting on a Friday, they know absolutely what they're asking for.
Yeah.
There's no other alternative. So it's a lung in my week.
Right.
So you can do it. So if you're sitting here going, these two guys, yeah, it's nice and easy if you're a consultant, you've got a bit of cash. You do not have to have a diary that is rammed packed with things. Your job as the leader, your job as the founder, as the entrepreneur, your primary job is to be on the deck of that boat looking at the horizon. You should be looking at the horizon. And I had a client who said to me, Andy, not only am I not on the horizon, on the deck looking forwards, he said, I'm in the galley down underneath rowing. And he said, the worst thing about people that row in a galley is they sit with their back to the direction of travel. When they're rowing, they're facing where they've come from. So he said, not only am I not looking at the future, not looking for risks and opportunities and the land of plenty. And, and Chris, you come from a country that, that's where everyone went. That's where they looked. They looked for opportunity.
Right.
I'm looking the other way and I'm busy rowing. So this whole ship is basically directionless because there's no one taking charge of it. So if you think your job is to row harder or row longer, you are absolutely doing it wrong. And I do not apologize for saying that. You are limiting your capacity to do amazing things. And you might, by some metrics, be doing okay right now. You might be making great money. You might be doing really well, but you are not in a business that's scalable and sustainable if that's what you're doing. If the answer is you to every question, I can do it, I'll fix it, I'll sort it, that is not scalable. You are not going to maximize your potential and everyone's potential. I was chatting to a client yesterday. It was an amazing meeting. And he said, I'm talking to some agency owners and they're telling me how bad this year has been and everyone, it's been a really bad year and the economy's awful. He said, I feel really guilty. We're smashing it. We're growing. We're doing really well. And so he said, what are we doing? Are we just lucky? And I said, look at what you're doing. Tell me why you think you're more successful than those agencies. And he sat down. I made him write it on a piece of paper. And he wrote down what they were doing. They have a plan. They have a growth plan. They have a niche that they operate in they absolutely know what they're good at. Their proposition is absolutely nailed down. They recruit incredibly good staff. They're in the regions. They're not in London, but they pay London wages. And everyone said he was mad to do that, but they pay London wages because they want to attract the best possible people. They have the best benefits package, they have the best training, and they are smashing it. There's no luck involved in that. And he has time for a meeting. He never cancels our meeting. He never moves our meeting. He always has time in his calendar because he is busy on the deck looking at where they're going, looking for the risks, looking for the change, looking for those clouds. Does that mean there's land or does it mean there's a storm? That's what he does. And he said, I don't kind of feel like I'm doing anything anymore. I said, other than running a successful business and having a life where you see your family, your kids love you, and that you have a loving family life at home. And by the way, he's now going to the gym again. And by the way, he gets time off for vacation. And by the way, he runs again, and he's contributing to his society, and he works as a coach at a rugby club, local rugby club. This is success. And you've got a business that's storming along. Do not feel guilty. Share the thinking with other people, but don't feel guilty about it.
Well, it's like what Jim Collins says, whenever you get that flywheel spinning, then all of a sudden, when a flywheel is going, you don't have to touch it as many times. You don't,
Yeah.
and one of the things that you reminded me of was I was 28 when I bought my first real estate firm, and I had no money. I mean, I leveraged myself to the hilt. I don't come from money, and I had not made a lot of money. I just basically found a seller who believed in me and was willing to do a lot of seller financing. And it was a miracle that I got it done, but I got it done. And so I took on every task myself. And I remember the first task I realized that I was way too expensive for, and it went from going to, there was a guy named Mike Berry who used to do real estate training courses. He was a consultant, and he would tell brokers. And in my case, I had to own my business for 2 years before I could become a broker, but I owned the business. And he would tell you how to run a good firm. And one of the things he says, you need to put an hourly wage on your time. You need to figure out, it's kind of like what Naval Ravikant, he did early on in his career. He started deciding, what is my time worth? What is my hourly rate? And I'm going to always, to the extent, and I've adopted this, you order a product, it doesn't work out that right. It's, you pay $50 for it to go to the post office, however long it takes to get it sent back. If it's more in your hourly rate to send that thing back, donate it. Don't waste your time on things that are not worth your time. Mine, after going to that consulting class with Mike Berry, was I was mowing my own grass in front of my office building. And it wasn't until I had this shift in thinking, this is nuts. One, and it doesn't always have to be work either, Andy. It can be like, for me, it was like, okay, I'm staying up here late at least twice a week to mow the grass in front of this office building when I could be at home with my 2 young daughters, spending time with them. And it would cost me probably at that time like $50 to have somebody mow the grass. Well, isn't it worth $50 to get to go spend that time that I'll never get back? Time being the most valuable non-renewable resource any of us have anyway. And so it was early on when I started. I still have a very difficult time. And now we own a retail business here in Tyler that my wife built by the sweat of her brow. I mean, it's become a local institution. And I've had to help her understand these things because she is very much of, I'll just do it myself. I have to take care of everybody. I'm competing against Amazon. I've got to make sure that we're on top of our game. But she started to, I've had to teach her, hey, no, you're way too valuable to the business and to me to be spending your time doing that. I want to go back though, and if people are listening to us and they're thinking, you know what, okay, I'm a solopreneur or something to that effect, the thought of hiring either a virtual assistant or a personal assistant like you have with Jenny, I can't even imagine that. How long did it take you, once you made the decision? Here's the main thing, because this is what I suffer with, because I need a personal assistant right now, and I'm kind of in this position on some of my businesses. And the calendar is a big one. The calendar is a big one. I have 4 businesses I'm running right now, and so all of them have different calendars that all sometimes and this show and then another podcast. And so how did you develop that trust with Jenny? Because that's what you talk about. One of the main reasons why a lot of these leaders end up with emotional overdraft is because they just don't trust anyone but themselves. How did you get to the point, and how long did it take before
you started realizing, oh, I can actually let go of my calendar. And what was that process like for you?
Um, it took me too long to come to that conclusion. I'm as guilty as anyone else. I have to work as hard as anyone else on reducing my emotional overdraft. Um, but I think, I suppose I started, but I'm trying to think about how Jenny and I started working together. I started by putting some checks and balances in place.
Mm,
So I have used a PA in the past, so I do know how to use a PA, and there is some skill involved in working well with a PA, giving them enough space to do their thing, and that you need to not intervene, otherwise you mess up the system, um, which is very hard to do. So we pretty much from the off, I made it very clear what I needed from her. I set the boundaries about what she was going to manage and what she wasn't going to manage. So she was going to manage my client diary, and that was it, not my personal diary. But I committed to keeping my personal diary up to date in the calendar, so she could see what was going on. But very quickly, she's a professional. I hired a professional. I hired someone with experience. I recruited well, so I invested the time in recruiting, and that's something people do typically badly. Spend more time. I used to work for an agency called Essence, who were incredibly successful. And they had 5 rounds of interviews for any job, for everybody who ever worked in the company. 5 rounds of interviews. Each interview had a very specific purpose. It was cultural, it was personality, it was attitudinal, it was skills, and so on. But they recruited incredibly well. And so I learned that lesson way back then. So with Jenny, I spoke to 5 or 6 PAs. I got them to talk to me about how they solve problems. Who are the people? Great question to ask in any interview is, who is your best boss? Because someone would immediately tell you how they like to be managed. My best boss was a guy that, always left me alone to get on with it. So that's someone who doesn't like being told what to do. Or, my best boss was someone who was always, we're always chatting. We were always talking to each other. We became firm friends. We spoke 10 times a day, if that's not the sort of person you want. But so I worked out with Jenny that she was going to be had the experience and the skills that I needed. But then I was very clear about the job description. So I gave her a role description and was very clear about what her requirements were and what my requirements were. And it became apparent so quickly that she was going to be fantastic. So then I transported the rest across. Then I transferred over my travel management. Then I transferred over some other things as well. She does my expenses and finances now as well. She's also the person that said to me, this summer just gone, I had a week off, and she said, in the following week, if we moved your diary around a little bit, you could quite easily take that second week off. And I hadn't had a 2-week holiday for decades, probably. But she said, I reckon we can move that one. If I speak to him, I'm pretty sure he can move that one. We could roll that one into another meeting. I could free up a second week for you. This is someone who'd been working with me for 3 months.
wow.
She found me, and I had a 2-week holiday, and it was bliss. I was actually desperate to come back to work, but that's not a bad thing. To force yourself to stay away, to see what happens. Maybe my clients are not going to need me. They're going to realize I'm a fraud. None of that happens. So that's how I worked it. I do want to come back to money because a cost is one of the big drivers of an emotional overdraft. We can't afford it. People say things like, we're short of money. We don't have the resources. We can't afford it. Those things. Cost is a big driver. And you touched on it. You are already paying that price somewhere. You're paying it personally, you're paying it physically, your family are paying it personally in your relationships, or you're paying other people to do it. You're probably the most expensive person in your business, and you should not be doing it. I'll give you a good example. I had a client who was expanding in the US, a great case study of someone who was very coachable and brilliant. And he was expanding in the US and needed to go on a bit of a road trip around certain cities. And I said, get a driver. He said, you must be joking. He used quite a rude word. He said, only people like that use drivers. What are you I'm not the guy that sits in the back. I'd sit in the front and chat to them. I said, yeah, but I need you to get to these meetings, and you need to be on your A game. You need to be relaxed. You need to be prepared. You don't need to be worrying about how do you find your way around a foreign city, driving on the wrong side of the road, because Americans don't know how to do that properly. Finding somewhere to park, running to your meeting, not knowing where the building is, not knowing how to get in there. Trust me, please do this for this trip. And it was a 6-week trip. It was quite a long trip into the States. And he came back and it was a very successful and fantastic trip. And he said, that was the best, I don't know, it cost to say $100 a day or whatever it was. He said, that was the best $100 a day I've ever spent. I didn't think I could afford it, but I don't know how I couldn't have afforded it. He said it was just, and that's what I mean about cost is the alternative to that $100 a day was him not being as well prepared, not winning as many new clients, not doing as well in those meetings, not feeling as deeply satisfied and nourished by the work that he was doing. And that's real tangible financial cost as well. So I think cost is a very interesting one. People say, I can't afford it. You are already paying for it. It's just where you're paying for it isn't always necessarily visible. So it's definitely something to consider. And hopefully people listening are going, I'm starting to see this. I'm starting to see how I could do it differently. It really is so important.
Yeah, I hope so too. I hope that they understand something that, and I'm like you, it took me way too long to figure out a lot of these things that I've started to implement as it relates to emotional health. And one of the biggest things was realizing that the single most vital business instrument, machine, anything I have is me. It's with me everywhere I go, and nothing works without me, being at my best. And then understanding a lot of the thing that's hard for people like us is understanding that even us, the overachievers, the type A, the doers, we only have so much bandwidth. There is only so much capacity. And yes, we will try to push it to its max, but then also realizing that's not a good thing. It goes back to what I was talking about with Jim Lair and the sprinters. Sprinters don't sprint every day. As a matter of fact, very rarely will they ever sprint to their maximum capacity while they're training. They usually try to hit about 80%. That way, the only time that they are going at 100% is when it matters the most, whenever they're in a race and they're trying to win a gold medal.
Spot on. I run half marathons and most of my training is at forever pace.
Yep.
You're running distances, but you're running at forever pace. You're not, then I do the sprint training and I do intervals and so on, but most of my mileage is at forever pace.
Yep.
And that's how business should be. That's how life should be. You should be moving at forever pace. And then when you need to sprint, you sprint. When you need to put in the effort, you put in the effort. But you cannot be running all the time like that. You simply can't do it. It's obviously ludicrous. It is obviously ludicrous.
100%. Now, before I let you go, I want just to kind of encapsulate again, the emotional overdraft. Any parting words on what people can expect to better understand as a result of this book, which I think is essentially a handbook for the 10 simple changes for balancing business success and well-being. And here's the thing too, I want to be sure and say to this audience, Andy, is that this isn't a work-life balance book. This is about, I think this is about emotional optimization, performance optimization. That's what this
performance
book is.
Optimization.
100%.
That is how I would describe it. Yeah,
100%.
that is exactly what it is.
And I know one of the things we talked about, I want to make sure that we didn't miss on the self-evaluation. I know we covered some elements of that, but did we cover that to the extent that you wanted to before?
No, and I thank you for bringing that up. And it was great. Got to tell you, everyone listening, that Jason's a really good interviewer, because right at the start, he said, is there anything that you need to make sure that we tell people that they're really going to benefit from? And I shared this thought, and I had, as I predicted I would, I completely forgot to mention it. And Jason's come back in and reminded me. So an object lesson in how to run an interview. But there's a thing called the self-assessment, and it's 50 questions online. It's free. It's at emotionaloverdraft.com. And you can print out the results, or I can get it emailed to you. And it's just 50 yes/no questions. And what it does is it will help you understand where your emotional overdraft is occurring. So there are 10 drivers of an emotional overdraft I identified in the research broadly. We've touched on JFDI, cost, duty, trust, these sorts of things. And if you answer these 50 questions, it produces a spider chart which shows where your emphasis is. And everybody's emotional overdraft shape is different. we all have different histories and different psychologies and different mentalities. So it always occurs in different shapes, but it will give you an idea where your emotional overdraft occurs most often. And that's then the thing to start being, if you're going to be sensitive to your thinking and to your feelings, that'll give you a clue to look for when those things are happening. When you're worrying about cost, when you're worrying about stepping in, where you hear yourself saying, yeah, but it's my business, I should. I should and I would are very good clue words to those sorts of things. So do the self-assessment. It's there, it's free. It's in the book as well, but you don't need to buy the book to do it. And I think that will help a lot of people. So thanks for bringing that up, Jason.
Terrific. And be sure and have Jenny send me a link with that so I can include in the show notes or anything else along those lines, Andy, that you would like to share with the audience.
I'll do that. Yeah, thank you.
With that, this has been a terrific conversation, and I hope it's not the last time that you come on the show. I want to hear from you every time you write a book, or just whenever we can have a jam session on some of this stuff that actually means so much to not only us, but should mean something to every business leader out there. How can people keep in touch with you, follow you, and learn more about? And maybe there's someone, a business leader that's listening today that could benefit from your services. How do we get in touch with you?
Yep. Thank you. So emotionaloverdraft.com is where you'll find, I produce articles, 2 or 3 articles a week. I produce a podcast as well. And there's lots of information about emotional overdraft and resources on there. So emotionaloverdraft.com. And then you can find me via that. I'm on LinkedIn and the book's in Amazon and all the usual places. But if you can support an independent bookshop, then do that. But yeah, that's where you'll find me.
Wonderful. Andy, this has been terrific. Thank you so much for joining us and sharing, your wisdom and knowledge is much appreciated. So with that, he's Andy, I'm Jason. Thanks for listening, and we are out. Well, that does it for this episode of the Jason Wright Show. Thank you so much for listening. This has been a Texas Titan Media production. Fourth Wall did the music. And as always, thank you so much for listening. Please consider going out to jasonwrightnow.com and signing up for the Vitruvian letter. Also, please go out to iTunes. It takes like 30 seconds to just leave us a 5-star rating. It does wonders for the podcast. I would be so grateful. And with that, until we meet again, go crush it and endeavor to improve always in all ways. I'm out.